Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, world leaders, ambassadors, and distinguished delegates, 1 year ago, I stood before you for the first time in this grand hall. I addressed the threats facing our world, and I presented a vision to achieve a brighter future for all of humanity. Today, I stand before the United Nations General Assembly to share the extraordinary progress we've made. In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay. America's economy is booming like never before. Since my election, we've added $10 trillion in wealth. The stock market is at an all-time high in history, and jobless claims are at a 50-year low. African American, Hispanic American, and Asian American unemployment have all achieved their lowest levels ever recorded. We've added more than 4 million new jobs, including 500,000 manufacturing jobs. We have passed the biggest tax cuts and reforms in American history. We've started the construction of a major border wall, and we have greatly strengthened border security. We have secured record funding for our military, $700 billion this year, and $716 billion next year. Our military will soon be more powerful than it has ever been before. In other words, the United States is stronger, safer, and a richer country than it was when I assumed office less than 2 years ago. We are standing up for America and for the American people, and we are also standing up for the world. This is great news for our citizens and for peace-loving people everywhere. We believe that when nations respect the rights of their neighbors and defend the interests of their people, they can better work together to secure the blessings of safety, prosperity, and peace. Each of us here today is the emissary of a distinct culture, a rich history, and a people bound together by ties of memory, tradition, and the values that make our homelands like nowhere else on earth. That is why America will always choose independence and cooperation over global governance, control, and domination. I honor the right of every nation in this room to pursue its own customs, beliefs, and traditions. The United States will not tell you how to live or work or worship. We only ask that you honor our sovereignty in return. From Warsaw to Brussels to Tokyo to Singapore, it has been my highest honor to represent the United States abroad. I have forged close relationships and friendships and strong partnerships with the leaders of many nations in this room, and our approach has always yielded incredible change. With support from many countries here today, we have engaged with North Korea to replace the specter of conflict with a bold and new push for peace. In June, I traveled to Singapore to meet face-to-face with North Korea's leader, Chairman Kim Jong-un. We had highly productive conversations and meetings, and we agreed that it was in both countries' interest to pursue the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Since that meeting, we have already seen a number of encouraging measures that few could have imagined only a short time ago. The missiles and rockets are no longer flying in every direction. Nuclear testing has stopped. Some military facilities are already being dismantled. Our hostages have been released, and as promised, the remains of our fallen heroes are being returned home to lay at rest in American soil. I would like to thank Chairman Kim for his courage and for the steps he has taken, though much work remains to be done. The sanctions will stay in place until denuclearization occurs. I also want to thank the many member states who helped us reach this moment, a moment that is actually far greater than people would understand, far greater, but for also their support and the critical support that we will all need going forward. Special thanks to President Moon of South Korea, Prime Minister Abe of Japan, and President Xi of China. In the Middle East, our new approach is also yielding great strides and very historic change. Following my trip to Saudi Arabia last year, the Gulf countries opened a new center to target terrorist financing. They are enforcing new sanctions, working with us to identify and track terrorist networks, and taking more responsibility for fighting terrorism and extremism in their own region. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar have pledged billions of dollars to aid the people of Syria and Yemen, and they are pursuing multiple avenues to ending Yemen's horrible, horrific civil war. Ultimately, it is up to the nations of the region to decide what kind of future they want for themselves and their children. For that reason, the United States is working with the Gulf Cooperation Council, Jordan, and Egypt to establish a regional strategic alliance so that Middle Eastern nations can advance prosperity, stability, and security across their home region. Thanks to the United States military and our partnership with many of your nations, I am pleased to report that the bloodthirsty killers known as ISIS have been driven out from the territory they once held in Iraq and Syria. We will continue to work with friends and allies to deny radical Islamic terrorists any funding, territory, or support, or any means of infiltrating our borders. The ongoing tragedy in Syria is heartbreaking. Our shared goals must be the de-escalation of military conflict, along with a political solution that honors the will of the Syrian people. In this vein, we urge the United Nations-led peace process be reinvigorated. But rest assured, the United States will respond if chemical weapons are deployed by the Assad regime. I commend the people of Jordan and other neighboring countries for hosting refugees from this very brutal civil war. As we see in Jordan, the most compassionate policy is to place refugees as close to their homes as possible, to ease their eventual return to be part of the rebuilding process. This approach also stretches finite resources to help far more people, increasing the impact of every dollar spent. Every solution to the humanitarian crisis in Syria must also include a strategy to address the brutal regime that has fueled and financed it, the corrupt dictatorship in Iran. Iran's leaders sow chaos, death, and destruction. They do not respect their neighbors or borders or the sovereign rights of nations. Instead, Iran's leaders plunder the nation's resources to enrich themselves and to spread mayhem across the Middle East and far beyond. The Iranian people are rightly outraged that their leaders have embezzled billions of dollars from Iran's treasury, seized valuable portions of the economy, and looted the people's religious endowments, all to line their own pockets and send their proxies to wage war. Not good. Iran's neighbors have paid a heavy toll for the region's agenda of aggression and expansion. That is why so many countries in the Middle East strongly supported my decision to withdraw the United States from the horrible 2015 Iran nuclear deal and reimpose nuclear sanctions. The Iran deal was a windfall for Iran's leaders. In the years since the deal was reached, Iran's military budget grew nearly 40%. The dictatorship used the funds to build nuclear-capable missiles, increase internal repression, finance terrorism, and fund havoc and slaughter in Syria and Yemen. The United States has launched a campaign of economic pressure to deny the regime the funds it needs to advance its bloody agenda. Last month, we began reimposing hard-hitting nuclear sanctions that have been lifted under the Iran deal. Additional sanctions will resume November 5th, and more will follow. And we are working with countries that import Iranian crude oil to cut their purchases substantially. We cannot allow the world's leading sponsor of terrorism to possess the planet's most dangerous weapons. We cannot allow a regime that chants death to America and that threatens Israel with annihilation to possess the means to deliver a nuclear warhead to any city on earth. Just can't do it. We ask all nations to isolate Iran's regime as long as its aggression continues. And we ask all nations to support Iran's people as they struggle to reclaim their religious and righteous destiny. This year, we also took another significant step forward in the Middle East in recognition of every sovereign state to determine its own capital. I moved the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. The United States is committed to a future of peace and stability in the region, including peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That aim is advanced, not harmed, by acknowledging the obvious facts. America's policy of principled realism means we will not be held hostage to old dogmas, discredited ideologies, and so-called experts who have been proven wrong over the years, time and time again. This is true not only in matters of peace, but in matters of prosperity. We believe that trade must be fair and reciprocal. The United States will not be taken advantage of any longer. For decades, the United States opened its economy, the largest by far on earth, with few conditions. We allowed foreign goods from all over the world to flow freely across our borders. Yet, other countries did not grant us fair and reciprocal access to their markets in return. Even worse, some countries abused their openness to dump their products, subsidize their goods, target our industries, and manipulate their currencies to gain unfair advantage over our country. As a result, our trade deficit ballooned to nearly $800 billion a year. For this reason, we are systematically renegotiating broken and bad trade deals. Last month, we announced a groundbreaking U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. And just yesterday, I stood with President Moon to announce the successful completion of the brand new U.S.-Korea trade deal. And this is just the beginning. Many nations in this hall will agree that the world trading system is in dire need of change. For example, countries were admitted to the World Trade Organization that violate every single principle on which the organization is based. While the United States and many other nations play by the rules, these countries use government-run industrial planning and state-owned enterprises to rig the system in their favor. They engage in relentless product dumping, forced technology transfer, and the theft of intellectual property. The United States lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs, nearly a quarter of all steel jobs, and 60,000 factories after China joined the WTO. And we have racked up $13 trillion in trade deficits over the last 2 decades. But those days are over. We will no longer tolerate such abuse. We will not allow our workers to be victimized, our companies to be cheated, and our wealth to be plundered and transferred. America will never apologize for protecting its citizens. The United States has just announced tariffs on another $200 billion in Chinese-made goods, for a total so far of $250 billion. I have great respect and affection for my friend, President Xi, but I have made clear our trade imbalance is just not acceptable. China's market distortions and the way they deal cannot be tolerated. As my administration has demonstrated, America will always act in our national interests. I spoke before this body last year and warned that the UN Human Rights Council had become a grave embarrassment to this institution, shielding egregious human rights abusers while bashing America and its many friends. Our ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, laid out a clear agenda for reform, but despite reported and repeated warnings, no action at all was taken. So the United States took the only responsible course. We withdrew from the Human Rights Council, and we will not return until real reform is enacted. For similar reasons, the United States will provide no support in recognition to the International Criminal Court. As far as America is concerned, the ICC has no jurisdiction, no legitimacy, and no authority. The ICC claims near universal jurisdiction over the citizens of every country, violating all principles of justice, fairness, and due process. We will never surrender America's sovereignty to an unelected, unaccountable global bureaucracy. America is governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism. Around the world, responsible nations must defend against threats to sovereignty, not just from global governments, but also from other new forms of coercion and domination. In America, we believe strongly in energy security for ourselves and for our allies. We have become the largest energy producer anywhere on the face of the earth. The United States stands ready to export our abundant, affordable supply of oil, clean coal, and natural gas. OPEC and OPEC nations are, as usual, ripping off the rest of the world. And I don't like it. Nobody should like it. We defend many of these nations for nothing, and then they take advantage of us by giving us high oil prices. Not good. We want them to stop raising prices. We want them to start lowering prices, and they must contribute substantially to military protection from now on. We are not going to put up with it, these horrible prices, much longer. Reliance on a single foreign supplier can leave a nation vulnerable to extortion and intimidation. That is why we congratulate European states such as Poland for leading the construction of a Baltic pipeline so that nations are not dependent on Russia to meet their energy needs. Germany will become totally dependent on Russian energy if it does not immediately change course. Here in the Western Hemisphere, we are committed to maintaining our independence from the encroachment of expansionist foreign powers. It has been the formal policy of our country since President Monroe that we reject the interference of foreign nations in this hemisphere and in our own affairs. The United States has recently strengthened our laws to better screen foreign investments in our country for national security threats. And we welcome cooperation with countries in this region and around the world that wish to do the same. You need to do it for your own protection. The United States is also working with partners in Latin America to confront threats to sovereignty from uncontrolled migration. Tolerance for human struggling and human smuggling and trafficking is not humane. It's a horrible thing that's going on at levels that nobody has ever seen before. It's very, very cruel. Illegal immigration funds criminal networks, ruthless gangs, and the flow of deadly drugs. Illegal immigration exploits vulnerable populations, hurts hardworking citizens, and has produced a vicious cycle of crime, violence, and poverty. Only by upholding national borders, destroying criminal gangs, can we break this cycle and establish a real foundation for prosperity. We recognize the right of every nation in this room to set its own immigration policy in accordance with its national interests, just as we ask other countries to respect our own right to do the same, which we are doing. That is one reason the United States will not participate in the new global compact on migration. Migration should not be governed by an international body unaccountable to our own citizens. Ultimately, the only long-term solution to the migration crisis is to help people build more hopeful futures in their home countries, make their countries great again. Currently, we are witnessing a human tragedy, as an example, in Venezuela, More than 2 million people have fled the anguish inflicted by the socialist Maduro regime and its Cuban sponsors. Not long ago, Venezuela was one of the richest countries on earth. Today, socialism has bankrupted the oil-rich nation and driven its people into abject poverty. Virtually everywhere socialism or communism has been tried, it has produced suffering, corruption, and decay. Socialism's thirst for power leads to expansion, incursion, and oppression. All nations of the world should resist socialism and the misery that it brings to everyone. In that spirit, we ask the nations gathered here to join us in calling for the restoration of democracy in Venezuela. Today we are announcing additional sanctions against the repressive regime, targeting Maduro's inner circle and close advisors. We are grateful for all of the work the United Nations does around the world to help people build better lives for themselves and their families. The United States is the world's largest giver in the world, by far, of foreign aid. But few give anything to us. That is why we are taking a hard look at U.S. foreign assistance. That will be headed up by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. We will examine what is working, what is not working, and whether the countries who receive our dollars and our protection also have our interests at heart. Moving forward, we are only going to give foreign aid to those who respect us and, frankly, are our friends. And we expect other countries to pay their fair share for the cost of their defense. The United States is committed to making the United Nations more effective and accountable. I have said many times that the United Nations has unlimited potential. As part of our reform effort, I have told our negotiators that the United States will not pay more than 25% of the UN peacekeeping budget. This will encourage other countries to step up, get involved, and also share in this very large burden. And we are working to shift more of our funding from assessed contributions to voluntary, so that we can target American resources to the programs with the best record of success. Only when each of us does our part and contributes our share can we realize the UN's highest aspirations. We must pursue peace without fear, hope without despair, and security without apology. Looking around this hall, where so much history has transpired, we think of the many before us who have come here to address the challenges of their nations and of their times. And our thoughts turn to the same question that ran through all their speeches and resolutions, through every word and every hope. It is the question of what kind of world will we leave for our children, and what kind of nations they will inherit. The dreams that fill this hall today are as diverse as the people who have stood at this podium, and as varied as the countries represented right here in this body are. It really is something. It really is great, great history. There is India, a free society, over 1 billion people, successfully lifting countless millions out of poverty and into the middle class. There is Saudi Arabia, where King Salman and the Crown Prince are pursuing bold new reforms. There is Israel, proudly celebrating its 70th anniversary as a thriving democracy in the Holy Land. In Poland, the great people are standing up for their independence, their security, and their sovereignty. Many countries are pursuing their own unique visions, building their own hopeful futures, and chasing their own wonderful dreams of destiny, of legacy, and of a home. The whole world is richer. Humanity is better because of this beautiful constellation of nations, each very special, each very unique, and each shining brightly in its part of the world. In each one, we see awesome promise of a people bound together by a shared past and working toward a common future. As for Americans, we know what kind of future we want for ourselves. We know what kind of a nation America must always be. In America, we believe in the majesty of freedom and the dignity of the individual. We believe in self-government and the rule of law, and we prize the culture that sustains our liberty, a culture built on strong families, deep faith, and fierce independence. We celebrate our heroes, we treasure our traditions, and above all, we love our country. Inside everyone in this great chamber today, and everyone listening all around the globe, there is the heart of a patriot that feels the same powerful love for your nation, the same intense loyalty to your homeland, the passion that burns in the hearts of patriots and the souls of nations has inspired reform and revolution, sacrifice and selflessness, scientific breakthroughs, and magnificent works of art. Our task is not to erase it, but to embrace it, to build with it, to draw on its ancient wisdom, and to find within it the will to make our nations greater, our region safer, and the world better. To unleash this incredible potential in our people, we must defend the foundations that make it all possible. Sovereign and independent nations are the only vehicle where freedom has ever survived, democracy has ever endured, where peace has ever prospered. And so we must protect our sovereignty and our cherished independence above all. When we do, we will find new avenues for cooperation unfolding before us. We will find new passion for peacemaking rising within us. We will find new purpose, new resolve, and new spirit flourishing all around us, and making this a more beautiful world in which to live. So together, let us choose a future of patriotism, prosperity, and pride. Let us choose peace and freedom over domination and defeat. And let us come here to this place to stand for our people and their nations, forever strong, forever sovereign, forever just, and forever thankful for the grace and the goodness and the glory of God. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless the nations of the world. Thank you very much. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the United States of America for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the President, after which the meeting will stand
All right,
suspended.
we're going to pull away from the United
Yes.
Nations. The President addressing the General Assembly for a little less than an hour, I guess, or so, right? And joining us now is Kylie Atwood, State Department reporter for CBS News.
Welcome.
So one of the things that we were sort of talking about as we were listening is, you know, a lot of what we heard from him we expected to hear. But did anything jump out at you as novel, different, new at all?
In terms of what he cited for progress for the United States, I mean, you saw at the top there when he spoke about the U.S. having accomplished more than any other administration in this year. And then there was resounding laughter.
Yes.
Yes.
Trump said, I didn't expect that,
Right.
but okay.
He said it's true.
Exactly.
But,
I mean, so then he tried to kind of move on and talk about what progress the administration has accomplished in the past year, and North Korea was on the top of that list. He spoke about Kim Jong-un and the courage and the steps that he has taken. He spoke about encouraging measures in terms of U.S.-North Korea talks, and that's all true to a degree, right? We have seen Kim Jong-un and President Trump meet in Singapore. We haven't seen much follow-up in terms of denuclearization, and Trump stayed pretty far away from that. These were some very nice words about Kim Jong-un, but to your guys' point, there wasn't a whole lot of other substance other than rolling out these new sanctions on Venezuelan officials, including President Maduro's wife today, which is a pretty bold move.
You know, it struck me that the speech had a lot of Stephen Miller's fingerprints on it, because there was a lot of ethno-nationalism, ethnocentrism, patriotism, and, you know, the president at one point saying, you know, globalism is a terrible thing and patriotism is a good thing. Well, in every country, every citizen feels some level of patriotism for their nation, for the place that they were born in, or for the place that they come from. The idea of governing, though, from that standpoint is sort of unique, and it sort of harkens back to policies that had long been sort of done away with in this country.
Governing from that standpoint, and also standing where he's standing at the headquarters of the United Nations, right? This is a body, an international body, that was created after World War II to avoid international conflict, to come together, to look at issues together, to really bring all these countries towards a more peaceful world. Trump is basically saying, you do what you want to do, we'll do what we want to do, let's protect sovereignty, and let's push on that as the way forward, rather than collective action altogether.
That's such a good point. And again, it's not to, I mean, you know, patriotism is a wonderful thing. And all of us here at this table and in this country are patriots and love our country, as do the people in that body. But your point is a good one, which is, in the wake of World War II, when it was very clear that the nations that make up this planet had not been able to come to agreements where they could deliver peace, that's why this body was created. It failed in the first go-around in 1914 or 1917 after World War I. So the president sort of suggesting that, look, we're going to do what we want to do, you guys do what you want to do, and let's see what happens, is probably...
Independence over global governance, control, and domination. That's what he was saying, and that's what he kept reiterating today. I also want to point out that he's also referencing past U.S. foreign policy objectives that this administration doesn't adhere to. He said that they're not going to be held hostage to the old dogmas of the past. And in that light, he's shown a light on the moving of the U.S. embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He also spoke about the trade conflict that he has gotten the U.S. into, basically trying to assert the U.S. position, this administration's position, onto foreign policy in a way that we haven't seen in the past.
That's really interesting. We want to stand by. We want to bring in Weijia Jiang. She's joining us from the United Nations in New York City. So, Weijia, I guess I'll first get your sort of overview. We were sort of discussing the speech and kind of, you know, remarking that there was nothing that's jumped out as remarkable. It's basically what we had expected. But what's your take on the speech that you heard from the president?
Oh, I think the three of you already hit it right on the head, which was everything he said sort of flew in the face of the spirit of the UN here. And he has been critical of the UN, certainly in the past leading up to this. In fact, he posted a video message that said he was surprised the UN could not accomplish more than it has, that it has potential that it has not reached, which he said here as well. And so this is exactly what we expected in terms of delivering yet another America First message. But I will say we were expecting more of a tale of two nuclear ambitions from Mr. Trump. However, it was an abridged version, right? Even though he thanked Kim Jong-un, he also acknowledged that there was still a lot of work left to do in terms of reaching that goal to denuclearization. And as we expected, he talked about Iran. Of course, the current situations for both, he believes, are dependent on their willingness to come to the negotiating table with the U.S. But the slamming Iran was no surprise, painting that picture as dire, as one that is not cooperative, and as sort of, criticizing the regime. He didn't mention, however, the fact that overnight, all of the other countries that are still part of that agreement recognize that the current Iran nuclear deal is working. Of course, President Rouhani said the same thing, that even though the president thought reimposing economic sanctions would be a strategy to put pressure on Iran, it's not. And so the burden is on President Trump to explain his strategy and why he believes pulling out of that deal remains the best way forward. And he did not talk about that during the speech.
I thought that was very interesting that he didn't talk about the other countries that had signed on to that deal at all, really. And he did sort of, spend a significant amount of time compared to the other topics in the speech, sort of attacking Iran.
Yeah. The other thing he didn't mention, Weijia, is he didn't talk about Russia and
Absolutely.
the meddling
Yes.
of what Russia is currently doing, not just in the United States, but around the world in meddling in elections. Was that surprising?
Well, I put it in all caps in my notes because Russia, ? Because he used a warning to Syria as a segue to Iran. He talked about, the consequences that would play out if there were more chemical weapons attacks on the civilians there. And then he said, it's not only Syria that has to be held accountable here, but also those forces behind Syria that are funding, what's happening there and allowing it to happen, and then went right into Iran's part. But you're right. In that moment, I expected him to also mention Russia. And he has, to be fair, in the past, even recently, warned Russia and Iran to stop their part in the Syrian conflict. Otherwise, they would face consequences as well. But you're absolutely right, Vlad. He did not do that. So here we are again on another massive global stage where the president had the opportunity to point the finger at Moscow, and he did not.
Right, and
instead, he went after Germany.
That's exactly what I was thinking, for doing business with Russia.
I mean, he said he warned Germany of becoming dependent on Russian energy, which he did over the summer at the NATO summit. We've seen this before, but he didn't specifically target Russia at all.
No, he didn't. He also talked about immigration, and we have some sound of what he had to say about that. Let's take a listen. It's there, I swear.
We recognize the right of every nation in this room to set its own immigration policy in accordance with its national interests, just as we ask other countries to respect our own right to do the same, which we are doing. That is one reason the United States will not participate in the new global compact on migration. Migration should not be governed by an international body unaccountable to our own citizens. Ultimately, the only long-term solution to the migration crisis is to help people build more hopeful futures in their home countries. Make their countries great again.
There you go. I got that line in there. But this is something that we heard from the Secretary of State recently when he talked about all that America does for migrants, and he basically said, over there, where they're at. The president reiterating this. I was asking you about the global compact on migration. This is not the first time that we've heard the president say not interested in participating in this. What is it?
Yeah, the global compact on migration is all of these countries coming together to try and figure out a way to make migration better, to work on it all together. The U.S. is stepping away from that. I mean, we saw just last week the State Department roll out a 30,000 refugee cap. That's the lowest in U.S. history since this refugee program created by the United States in 1980 was even created. So we didn't hear any countries coming forward and supporting supporting the U.S. for that decision. That is really important. We expected humanitarian organizations to come out against the U.S., but we didn't expect such a calmness, such a lack of commentary from foreign nations who are the ones that are actually, putting up their houses, their countries to support these refugees because the U.S. is closing the door.
Weijia and Kylie, I want to get your take on what the president had to say about North Korea. Let's play a little bit of that.
The missiles and rockets are no longer flying in every direction. Nuclear testing has stopped. Some military facilities are already being dismantled. Our hostages have been released, and as promised, the remains of our fallen heroes are being returned home to lay at rest in American soil. I would like to thank Chairman Kim for his courage and for the steps he has taken, though much work remains to be done. The sanctions will stay in place until denuclearization occurs.
That's an important message,
It is an important message, although I wonder, Weijia, and then Kylie, you can jump in on this. Gina Haspel, the CIA director, has remained skeptical about the moves that North Korea is making, seemingly to contrast the president's optimism.
Right, and here's why. All those things that the president just listed were things that were also true about a month ago when he canceled Secretary Pompeo's trip to North Korea, citing a lack of progress. So what happened between then and now? Well, Kim Jong-un sent him a letter requesting a second meeting. He also had a military parade that did not showcase the missiles as he did in the past, and that's really it. But in terms of concrete deliverables or any kind of plan that shows that he's actually committed to taking steps forward to denuclearize, we don't have that. And that's why the skepticism is there, and that's why the president has yet to answer why he has this renewed optimism 1 month later after canceling that trip. And something the administration has not answered is, even though they say that a second summit is on the brink and they believe it will happen in the not too distant future, they haven't answered how is the strategy going to be different from the first summit, and what are they going to hope to leave with in terms of what they learned after the first one, because here we are again, them having to say and acknowledge that they still have a lot of work to do. And so I think President Rouhani was listening. I think Kim Jong-un was listening. And Kim got, again, what he always wanted, which was President Trump, the President of the United States, standing here, thanking him in this way and showing optimism all week. Meanwhile saying, by the way, the sanctions are going to stay in place. So if anything, President Rouhani could say that in this tale of two nuclear powers, that actually North Korea is not getting much. And so why would Iran come to the bargaining table when the president is not making any kind of concessions during this negotiating process? And so even though the president took a mild victory lap, it wasn't as much as I expected, especially compared to this time last year when he coined the phrase Little Rocket Man and said he was going to totally destroy North Korea.
Kylie?
Yeah, I also want to point out the North Koreans are playing hard to get with the U.S. this week. Pompeo has extended an invite to meet with the foreign minister of North Korea, who's here leading the North Korean delegation, and they haven't heard back yet.
Oh, that's interesting.
Gosh, I mean, you expect to put your hand out as a gesture, and the North Koreans haven't gotten back to them. That doesn't look so good for the United States here. It's something that the North Koreans are known to do. They don't necessarily follow through on all of their plans. But I also want to point out that Trump referenced North Korea destroying some of its missile test launch sites. He wasn't able to cite any of the nuclear test sites that they are dismantling. In fact, North Korea told President Moon during their meeting just last week that they would do that if the U.S. took corresponding measures.
Right.
And that's something
That's why it was significant that he said the sanctions were going to stay in place. Because I thought whatever message you're sending to North Korea, that's all they care about, that last line right there.
Yeah.
And so, what are you saying to encourage them to sort of move forward?
And critics are saying, why sit down at the table with Kim Jong-un again when you don't don't know what you're going to get.
Right.
I mean, it's a great point. The other point that I want to get Ouija's reaction to is the president talking about immigration. I'm not sure if we have some sound from that. Do we have sound of the president talking about immigration?
I think it might.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's the stuff that we aired about the global compact on migration.
Right,
but what specifically were you thinking of?
I was curious about what he said, Ouija, where he said illegal immigration fuels crime, violence, and poverty, sort of reiterating a theme that the president has used before, whether he's at one of his rallies or whether he's delivering remarks to the press, equating illegal immigration with all these terrible things that happen, which is not
but
always
not
the case.
mentioning Mexico.
Yeah. Not mentioning Mexico
specifically.
And what stands out when he's talking about immigration and migration is that he, just like when the chaos was unfolding at our own border here, he does not make the distinction for refugees, for people who are fleeing their home countries because they feel like they have no choice, because they feel like their lives are at stake. He sort of just puts a blanket over anybody who is trying to leave their country and go somewhere else. And I think that's where he makes a mistake because, especially here at this international community, that is a very important distinction. And again, he has not made that. And so for him to continue his argument that he makes, more so for his base, I would say, than any other, I think just shows that in the back of his mind, he always knows his audience. And it's not necessarily the audience sitting right before him.
All right, Ouija Zhang for us at the UN. Ouija, thank you as always. We appreciate it. We'll talk to you a little bit later.
Sure.
Kylie, you're sticking around, so let's talk about China. Let's play what the president had to say about China, and then we'll get your reaction.
To sound on China and the sanctions, I believe, or the trade.
The United States has just announced tariffs on another $200 billion in Chinese-made goods, for a total so far of $250 billion. I have great respect and affection for my friend, President Xi, but I have made clear our trade imbalance is just not acceptable. China's market distortions and the way they deal cannot be tolerated.
So it's interesting, the president's sort of walking that fine line between criticizing the Chinese, but also talking about how he's got great respect for Xi Jinping and
earlier
their
in
friends.
the speech, he praised China for their assistance with North Korea.
It's important, I think, to highlight what the president is saying about China, because on one hand, you do have to walk that fine line. China is a massive superpower, and we do have enormous trade with that country. There are problems with the way China manages its economy, and I guess the president is trying to address that. The question, of course, is, some cases, for example, it's hurting American farmers and manufacturers, and that's the line that he's trying to thread.
And the administration has had to subsidize these decisions that they've made on trade, to back up their actions, because they are hurting American farmers. And also, these foreign countries aren't stupid. They're going to come back at the U.S. and target cities and target states that are known to have Trump supporters, because we're coming up on the midterms right now. And so they want to go back at the U.S. and hurt Trump where it hurts most. And that could be at the polls, right? But it's also a little bit confusing here, because we have seen, as you said, Trump say that China has been helpful on North Korea, but actually they haven't been all that helpful on North Korea. They're the ones that are still fueling North Korea's economy, and they are the ones that have been allowing certain things to go across that border continually.
Right.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about this idea of sovereignty and focusing inward and less about agreeing and coming to the table with partners and allies around the world. I just wonder, and there's a lot of people in this country who like this approach. They think that the United States over the course of many years has been taken advantage of by partnering with other nations. I guess my question is, just taking a step back, the idea that in some instances the United States may not get everything that it wants, but it does get peace in all parts of the world, where countries know that if they attempt annexations, if they attempt to commit genocide on their own people, that the United States will be there to prevent that from happening. And by the president saying, look, do what you got to do within your own borders, as long as it's in your national interest, we're going to do what we want to do, could be detrimental in the long term, not for us, but for people in marginalized countries, people in countries where governments do not take any hints or advice from a country like the United States, who says, I'm not going to get involved.
Right, and a lot of times U.S. foreign policy, U.S. aid is strategic. They're thinking about the long game. They're not thinking about what happens tomorrow or what Rouhani said about President Trump last week.
Or the elections.
Exactly. And so what President Trump said in this speech is, you know, the U.S. is going to be giving aid to those who respect us. That's a little bit of a different take on what U.S. foreign policy has traditionally followed in the past. You know, Egypt is not necessarily a country that always respects the United States. They're one of our largest recipients of foreign aid, and there's a reason for that, because they are a pillar of stability in an area where the U.S. wants to see a stable Middle East.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, because I was going to pivot a little bit.
So the last thing I want to say is that then the question again becomes, if the United States is ceding and, you know, saying that we're going to focus more on within our own national interest and within our own borders, then that leaves a vacuum. And who is left to fill that vacuum, if not China or perhaps some other country, even,
Russia?
for example, the Russians and the Saudis? Is that so? To your point about not worrying about the elections, not worrying about the base, in 10 or 15 years, when U.S. influence is not what it was because of China seeing that vacuum and sort of filling it. I see that. I've seen that in Africa, for example.
I think it's already been happening. I mean, you know, we've certainly seen China with its economic influence across the globe. But you're right. Now, sort of on the heels of China, we're seeing other countries like Saudi Arabia, like even India. Like
India's another one. Exactly.
You know, what I wanted to pivot back to is the Iran deal, right? We have a little more sound that I wanted to play. And then I want to talk to you about the fact that, you know, the president had said before that he would be open to meeting with President Rouhani. Let's just listen to what he had to say.
Iran's leaders sow chaos, death, and destruction. They do not respect their neighbors or borders or the sovereign rights of nations. Instead, Iran's leaders plunder the nation's resources to enrich themselves and to spread mayhem across the Middle East and far beyond. That is why so many countries in the Middle East strongly supported my decision to withdraw the United States from the horrible 2015 Iran nuclear deal and reimpose nuclear sanctions.
So what I thought was sort of interesting about those words is that it was really personal attack on the leadership. And I know we've been hearing that from the Secretary of State, you know, we've heard him often say, you know, if the people of Iran don't like what's happening, they should probably address it with their leadership. But that's sort of, I heard a reinforcement of that. And what of this, hey, I'd be willing to meet with President Rouhani. Obviously, that's not happening, especially if you say things like that.
Exactly. I mean, and truth be told, we don't know what's happening behind closed doors and back channels. Last year at the UN General Assembly, it was the U.S. that went to the French and asked if Rouhani would sit down with President Trump. And the Iranians said no. So perhaps the U.S. is actually floating that out because they really do want a meeting to happen, but they don't want to be embarrassed on the public world stage, right? But also, when we look at Iran, we're going to have a lot more tomorrow because President Trump is hosting the UN Security Council meeting that is focused on non-proliferation, and the U.S. wants Iran to be the focus of that. So Trump is probably going to face some blowback from his allies who are not so supportive of what the U.S. has done with regard to pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal.
Kylie Atwood, always great to have your analysis and your reporting. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. We appreciate it. All right, so we are going to take a quick break. There's still a lot more news ahead for us here at CBSN, so stick around. We're going to get back to you just after this break.